people would tend to think of plays being translated into another language. And indeed, that is how it's been for a lot of world theatre. It's through translated text that we have come to access the greats like Chekhov and Ibsen and Brecht. But in the Singapore context, in the context of Singapore theatre, the need for translation goes a bit deeper in the context of a multilingual society where every person lives with several different languages, most of them with an imperfect degree of understanding. So for the theatre scene in Singapore, prior to the 1980s, there existed 4 distinct language streams. There was English language theatre, Chinese theatre, Malay theatre, and Tamil theatre. But from the 1980s onwards, the different streams coalesced as English became more widely used and more people came to have a command of at least 2 of these languages. So now, I think you have an interesting situation where, for example, someone in the English language theatre would have to encounter and experience translation as part of the process of creating the play. Maybe when interviewing someone whose language, who's more fluent in a language other than English as part of his research process for the play, or say in working with actors whose first language is not English during the rehearsal process, or even when considering whether to include Chinese or Malay dialogue as part of an English language play. So that's a very interesting thing about Singapore theatre, the increasingly multilingual nature of it. So today I'm very pleased to be introducing our speakers, because all of them have intimate experience with translation and bicultural or intercultural theatre. So we'll start with Hua Siren on my extreme left. He is, in my view, not only one of Singapore's most incisive Chinese language playwrights, but also a noted academic in the field of modern Chinese literature and Singapore Chinese literature and theatre. Dr. Hua is presently Associate Professor of the Nanyang Technological University's Chinese Division. Next we will have Harish Sharma. Harish is resident playwright of the Necessary Stage and arguably Singapore's leading socio-political playwright who has written more than 100 plays and that were performed in 15 cities. A Chinese translation of his selected works, done by media professional Ina Chang, was recently published. And to conclude, we'll have Jeremy Tiang. He's a writer and translator who has translated the works of some of Singapore's best-known Chinese language writers into English, including, for the first time, the complete plays of Hua Siren. So let us start by giving a warm welcome to Hua Siren.
Thank you, Clarissa. When I was preparing for this panel, I intended to say something more political. As we know that language and translation in certain ways rather political. But Dan told me that it's Saturday afternoon, so it should be more casual. So I tried to say something not so heavy. While I'm talking, I'm also going through a process of translation because apparently English is not my native tongue. I think my thought process is going on in Chinese Mandarin, so I have to go through a process of translation in my mind before I speak out. So that is part of the reality in Singapore, facing predominantly English-speaking audience. Let me start a little bit back in the 90s, when I first met Harish in the 90s. I watched his plays in the substation, Those Who Can't Teach. I was very, very impressed and excited. was one of the first English language plays that I've seen, and we became friends over the decades. In one instance, he asked me to do a translation of his plays. That was in 1993, if I didn't remember wrongly. 1 + 1 = 3. Do you still remember that? So I translated the text, the plays from English to Chinese, and the plays were staged in English, in Mandarin, directed by Ho Ping-Luan and Lin Yan-e in the old drama center. I don't think my experience is very typical of the Chinese, of a playwright from the Chinese language, Chinese-speaking theater scene. Perhaps it's because of my exposure and the chances I have to interact with people from the English-speaking community. So we have a lot of exchanges, and translation became something rather natural. In the past, like what Clarissa said, you can see that, especially in theater, there are Chinese language theater, English language theater, Malay, Tamil, etc. And these communities do not really interact among each other, especially before the 1980s. So translation may not be something that is translation may not appear to be necessary, since each community will have their own audience and do their own productions and speak within the community itself. So I think the translation of plays is something very significant. Harash has a collection of plays translated into English, into Chinese by Inner Chang, Zhang Xinhong by Inner Chang. With this translated text, people from the Chinese-speaking community will be able to understand what's happening in the English theater, English language theater, and vice versa. And Jeremy is translating some plays by myself. Clarissa says it's a complete works. It sounds a little bit like, okay, from now on I'm not going to write anything more. So you have the complete works, like the complete works of Gu Baokun. But if we bring this back further, when we look at the 50s and 60s, the situation then was a little bit different. Well, incidentally, today is a very special day. If some of you are aware of, it's the 50th anniversary of the Operation Coastal. Well, it's too bad. I started to become political again. Many of those arrested during Operation Coastal might have a chance to sit in this chamber if they were not arrested. And many of them were Chinese educated, Chinese speaking. I'm not going to talk about this incident, but it is quite representative of the days in the 50s and 60s when many Chinese educated Singaporean or Malayan in that rhetorical context wanted to reach out to communicate, to break the boundaries between language and culture. So the Chinese language theatre will translate literary works, plays from many other languages, including Malay. And also some other language community, like the Malay language, Malay community, they will translate works in Chinese into Malay. Sriwana has performed Cao Yu's thunderstorm, Lei Yu, translated into Malay and performed in Malay in the early 60s. So there were a lot going on during that era, in the 50s and 60s, in a very specific historical context. But nowadays it's quite different. Since the late 60s until all the way to the 80s and 90s, the translating process and practice is not as common and as vibrant as that in the 50s and 60s. Of course, there are some other political and social reasons for this. One, I'm talking bringing out all these in this panel is that we need to look at how translation is related to the social and political and cultural context of a certain era. Is there a need? Is there an urge? Is there a motivation to do translation? And who should do translation? Who should take the initiative to reach out? Is it the ones who are powerful or the ones who are marginalized? Ironically, in reality, it is more common that those who are marginalized has bigger motivation to hope that translation is in place for those who are empowered to understand them, but not the other way around. And that is why translation perhaps is not so, is not a very common practice in Singapore, other than in the parliament where there are translation among 4 languages. It is virtually non-existent in other social aspects. So this is also a legacy from the past. Okay, let's not be so political. Coming back to my personal experience, I write in Chinese. My plays are mainly staged in Chinese, Mandarin, and sometimes multilingual. It's a pity to me that my friend Haransh won't be able to understand what is being said on stage. He came to plays that I wrote and in Mandarin, so he sat through the whole performance. I'm really appreciative of that. In the earlier days, Invisibility and later plays as well. You know, so because of our friendship, we have an urge to understand each other more and in depth. That, to me, is something essential. If you treat this person as a friend, you want to know more. So I'm glad that now Jeremy is taking on this project to translate most of my plays into English. I will surely give a copy to Haransh, and I hope he will read it. Okay, that's all I will say for now, and I hope to hear from the audience later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suren. It's interesting what you said, the point that translation is actually less common now, translation in the theatre being actually less common now than in the 1960s, because people presuppose that everyone understands English, English which is the language of officialdom and which has become over the years the dominant language in the education system. So I think that's the political aspect of what Sarah is talking about, and yeah, I think it's really interesting that we could discuss later. But next, it's my pleasure to introduce Harishama.
Thanks, Clarissa. And thank you, Sarah, for making me reminisce. I think from a playwright's point of view, I was very fortunate when Ina, who was this lady that I never met, came to watch some of my plays in maybe about 2006, 2007. And after that, she approached me and said she would, like to translate some of my plays into Mandarin. And of course, I was very, very happy. And so I just gave her the transcripts. And again, I don't read, speak, or understand Mandarin, so I couldn't even participate in the process really. I mean, she asked for context, I gave her definitely serious content. And everything else she did on her own, applying for grants, getting a publisher, and sending out manuscripts to people for comments and all that. And next thing I knew, I think about a couple of years later, the publication was released. And of course I was happier than I'd ever been, especially because it's unexpected. When you publish a play in English, you kind of like, yeah, I know I wrote this play, I read it before. But when you see something in Mandarin, you just see the names in English and everything else looks so exotic. And because it looks so exotic, it feels more important than your play that's published in English. So I was very fortunate in that sense because for many, many years, I was always wondering why nobody wanted to translate my plays. Back in the 90s, for example. And I'm glad you brought up 1 + 1 = 3 because it's a kind of like a sitcom play, and of all plays, I mean, there are so many other that would have been better served, in translation. And so I've had many conversations with friends and directors and theatre people, back in the 90s. And I was a bit envious because, Bob Alpun's plays were translated, why don't mine? Not even in Malay, not even in English, not in any language. And at first, so it started me thinking on how does one translate? Maybe it's because I create characters that are very, very rooted in language and religion and race and class and all kinds of things. So, and within the characters that I create, they tend to code switch as well. They use different languages or they use different registers. And so even in my mind, I'm thinking, how does one translate that? How does one translate a play like Off Center, for example, which has a character Saloma speaking in broken English to a friend, speaking in Malay to her mother, Vino speaking a different English to Saloma speaking in a different kind of bad code switching to Malay security guard. And so there are all these different types of languages operating, and like Sarah said, with language, there's suggestions of class, suggestions of power. And so I just kind of said, okay, maybe only those allegorical type of plays get translated, or plays that have one rush of language, like the Chekhov, for example, or Ibsen, because you just see everything in English except for an occasional Frau or something like that. And back in the day, one of the first plays I wrote, Lanterns Never Go Out, I had to write a paragraph from a mother talking to the daughter. And so what I did was, I wrote it in English, or in my kind of English that would be appropriate to the mother. And then I asked the actors to translate it to Teochew, because that was the language that the mother would be speaking in. And after she translated it into Teochew, I asked her, I can't remember whether it was her or someone else, to do a literal translation back to English. So eventually I got an English text from the mother, but it had gone through a form of translation that we were doing on our own within our theatre, you know. So then I thought, okay, maybe that's something interesting I can do on my own, in my own writing, in terms of dealing with the idea of translation, because some of the characters that I created would not normally speak in English, right? So I'm writing a character that actually, she's speaking Teochew to her daughter, but I need to write it in English. So this is my process for getting it to capture the rhythm of nuances or something. So that's the second thing that I kind of try out in my writing. And most recently, I had a very interesting project. It's a play called Best Of, and it's a one-woman show. It's basically about a young Malay Muslim woman who's going through a divorce, and she's speaking to the audience and basically talking about the different aspects of her life, her family, her work, her divorce, and the people that she's been meeting along the way. And at the talkbacks after the show, people asked if I would, we want to get the play translated into Malay. And Alvin, who is the artistic director of Necessary Stage, made a very interesting comment, because he mentioned that the fact that me writing the play in English is already, in a sense, a translation. You know what I mean? That means I have translated this girl story in English into English because I'm reaching out to the English-speaking audience, when in actual fact this play should have been in Malay. Does that make sense? In the sense that, yeah. So if someone were to translate it to Malay, they would then have to almost adapt it to a Malay setting, because some of the things she says in English, like, according to the Muslim Sharia law, a woman cannot ask for a divorce, whereas it's easier for men to do so. Some of these things, or like, we believe that after you die, you have to go through this process, which if you were speaking in Malay, it would sound weird saying it. Even the actress said, if you were translated to Malay, I wouldn't say that, because if you're translating it into Malay, you're assuming that those who are watching it understand Malay, and therefore they understand more the kind of Islamic practices. So that was my third, that's the third thing I want to bring up, the idea of how, when you write in English, or you write in multicultural English, just multicultural Singapore languages, which is what I do, because I guess fortunate in the sense that I don't get pigeonholed as an Indian writer or whatever it is. I'm not an Indian writer, I'm a Singapore writer. And I don't have that kind of racial constituency, because my plays are multilingual most of the time. So for me, writing this character in Malay, this Malay character in English, is a very natural thing. And if it gets translated to Malay, I think the way I see it, probably needs another kind of a playwright type of a person who would be able to almost adapt it to a Malay reader or Malay audience. Yeah. That's all I want to say for now. Thank you.
Harish, in talking about Ina Chang, who translated his works, well, it's a pity that Ina can't be here today, but he's brought up an unseen aspect of the role of the translator, which is that of a kind of a literary champion of certain writers that he or she believes should be read by a community that cannot access that playwright because of the language barrier. So Jeremy, as a translator, I think it would be interesting to find from him why he chose to select the particular writers that he did. Because I think translators also do function in a way as literary activists as well. So over to you, Jeremy.
Thanks, Marissa. I first got to know Siren when I was a student at Hwa Chong Junior College, and Siren was teaching there, though he never taught me. But he was an active part of the college's theatrical scene, And the thing about Hua Chong is that there were these two big things of theatre. The Chinese theatre evening was created entirely by the students. They would write plays, design costumes, do the makeup, do the scenery, everything. And it was called Huang Sheng Ye Yun, and it was quite a well-known within the Chinese community theatrical event. And the plays that were staged as part of Huang Sheng Ye Yun would be exuberant, surreal, sometimes surprisingly political, considering they were written by 17-year-olds, and really vibrant and exciting. And the English language drama society was run by a British expat and would tend to do British plays with a full drawing room set and fireplace and British furniture and really things that were quite hard for a Singaporean audience to relate to, except we all knew it through growing up in Enid Lytton. So I think the whole experience, if you're wondering, I did the English Drama Society. The whole experience brought home to me that translating for theatre isn't just a function of language, but of completely different theatrical cultures, and that Chinese language theatre and English language theatre aren't the same, but with different languages, there are actually different sensibilities and different aesthetics and different values even. And one of my formative experiences was seeing two of Siren's plays being staged at the substation, Invisibility, and then a few years later, Bona, which was based on his play Dragonbone. Both were staged by Drama Box, and both really pushed my conception of what theatre could be, of how it didn't have to be naturalistic, it didn't have to be narrative-driven. I think that was really my first encounter with director's theatre, where it seemed to me that Siren had written a script, not as a complete work in itself, but as a starting point for the director to go off in crazy new directions. And then if you've seen Bona, you know exactly what I mean. It's a piece that I can't describe it. It was very odd. It left me feeling unsettled for a while afterwards. And so when I came to choose work to translate into English, Siren's plays seemed the natural choice for the first collection that I did. Partly because I think he's such an important voice within the Chinese language theatre scene that I feel he should be brought to a wider audience. And what I really hope will come out of this collection is that English language theatre groups will pick up these plays and stage them. I think there's limited utility to reading plays on the page, and I try to translate an eye to performance and creating versions of the text that you could put on stage. So there is this awareness of trying to bring it slightly within the English theatrical culture, which expects different things without losing the sense of the original. But also, really, part of the reason I chose Siren was just, I wanted to see what would happen. I wanted to see what English-speaking audiences would make of his work, which is very different to anything I've ever seen in the English language. And there was a reading last night of Dragonbone in English, and it seemed to go down reasonably well. Although I think some of the more traditionally minded English-speaking audience members had reactions that, I guess you could call it polite bafflement, which is interesting, because I think there is a tendency of English audiences to go, but what's the story? Who are the characters? What do they want? And you're like, well, Chinese theatre doesn't always work like that. It can be quite symbolic and abstract and, well, not so much surreal as not that concerned with reality in and of itself. And I think you are, I think for me it's not just putting the work in English, but also saying to audiences there is a whole world of cultures out there that you've never experienced because you don't speak these languages, but lucky you, here is something different to anything you've ever seen, and see what you make of that. So I hope it will provoke debate or reactions, and shake up people's ideas of what theatre is and what theatre can be. Because as we've heard a few times today, St. Paul's theatrical culture is credited to develop quite separately with very little dialogue between them. And even now, I find it quite difficult to persuade my friends to go and see a play in Chinese. There'll be subtitles, and they'll say, no, we're not interested. And there is, I think, this mental block against experiencing something from a different culture, but I think erasing the linguistic gap at least brings us one step closer together. And hopefully, down the road, we'll be able to move towards a more coherent theatrical identity, which I don't know if we have in Singapore yet. I think there's a very fragmentary sense of what theatre is, but people are doing their own thing in silence. And there isn't, as far as I can see, enough dialogue between the different communities and sectors. And translation is my way of trying to bring everyone closer together. So we'll see how that pans out.
Thank you, Jeremy. Now, having heard from our three speakers, I'd like to throw we would like to throw the spotlight to the floor for questions.